10 feet, less than 10,000 pounds. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, little boy, on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. A few seconds later, a blinding light. Then, a blast that consumed everything in its path. Nearly 140,000 people lost their lives that day. 72 hours later, another atomic bomb, called Fat Man, was dropped over the city of Nagasaki, where it killed close to 80,000 people. These were the first, and to this day, the only atomic bombs that have been used in a war. And yet, countries have never stopped making nuclear bombs. Instead, they've become even more destructive over time. Today, nuclear weapons have nothing in common with those of 1945. Since the first atomic bombs, called the A-bombs, the global nuclear arsenal has been refined, especially with the arrival of the hydrogen bomb. And these terrifying weapons are more relevant than ever.
Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time.
Remember, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Iran condemns the United States' aggression against Iran's nuclear facilities.
But concretely, what actually goes into making a nuclear bomb, and just how difficult is it? Berlin, December 1938. Hitler is in power in Nazi Germany, and a war is imminent. It's in that context that two German chemists at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute accidentally discovered nuclear fission. Back then, uranium was the heaviest element that we knew about. But two researchers, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were obsessed with the idea of creating an even heavier element. To do this, they tried a new method, bombarding uranium with neutrons. Neutrons are small particles with no electric charge that are found in the nucleus of atoms. And what happened next left them speechless. Instead of creating a heavier element like they wanted to, they ended up with two lighter ones. Strassmann and Hahn don't understand what's going on, but they sense that they've just made a major discovery. To try to understand what happened, they shared their findings with an Austrian scientist who's an expert in atomic physics. Lisa Meitner, who was Jewish and living in exile in Sweden at the time, received this letter.
I agreed with Strassmann that we would only tell you for the time being. Perhaps you can come up with some sort of fantastic explanation. You would be doing us a great service if you could find a solution.
And with the help of her nephew, a physicist called Otto Frisch, she realized that splitting a uranium nucleus in two produced an extremely high amount of energy. That's when Otto Frisch gave this phenomenon the name of nuclear fission. When it splits, uranium produces 2 to 3 additional neutrons, which in turn can hit new nuclei, and so on, creating a chain reaction. Then, other scientists realized that this chain nuclear reaction could generate enough energy to make a nuclear bomb. And you have to remember what's happening in the world at that time. It's 1938, and Hitler is in power. German scientists discover a phenomenon that could be used to create the most powerful bomb ever. That's huge news. The news quickly spreads across the Atlantic, and the US launches itself in a race for the bomb. This is the famous Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer, etc.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
And they succeeded. On July 16, 1945, the US tested the first ever nuclear bomb. Uranium isn't the only thing that you can use to create a nuclear bomb. The process also works with plutonium. But unlike uranium, plutonium isn't readily available in the ground. You have to manufacture it, which is expensive and difficult. In this video, we'll focus on uranium only, not plutonium. So it sounds like all you need to make a bomb is uranium, right? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. To produce a chain reaction, you can't just use any uranium. In nature, uranium exists in several forms, which are called isotopes. They're atoms that are almost identical, but have slightly different masses and therefore different physical properties.
If you were to get uranium from the ground, you mined it out of the earth. Most of that uranium in nature is a type of uranium known as uranium-238. That's what we call an isotope of uranium. A small amount, less than 1%, is going to be uranium-235, another isotope.
To trigger a fission reaction, what we need is uranium-235.
It turns out that uranium-238 cannot sustain a fission chain reaction. The physics just doesn't allow for it. Uranium-235, however, can. So if you have enough uranium-235 and you bombard it with neutrons, it will split, create more neutrons, and find other uranium-235 atoms to split.
And remember, uranium-235 is less than 1% of uranium found in nature. And to make a bomb, you need a lot of it. And that's where uranium enrichment comes in. Essentially, we need to increase the amount of uranium-235 and reduce the amount of uranium-238. Uranium enriched at 3 to 5% is considered low enriched. It can be used to generate electricity in a nuclear plant. That's what we call civilian use. From 20% on, we're dealing with highly enriched uranium. This is used for compact reactors, like the ones powering a submarine. And once uranium is enriched at 90%, that's what we call weapons-grade uranium, which can be used for a bomb. There are two main ways to enrich uranium: gaseous diffusion and the centrifuge.
You basically make the uranium into a gas, and you put it into a container at relatively high pressure. And on one side of this container, you have a sort of a barrier. So the barrier is a substance that looks like it's pretty solid, but actually has lots and lots of microscopic holes in it. So what you do is you have this high pressure uranium gas, you have a barrier, and you're pushing that gas through the barrier. And the uranium-235, because it's a little bit smaller, is going to go through slightly faster than the uranium-238.
Another approach is to use a centrifuge. This works by spinning uranium really quickly. Because uranium-238 is a bit heavier, it gets pushed outwards, while uranium-235 is gathered at the center. And here again, you need to do this thousands and thousands of times using thousands of centrifuges.
That's actually a lot of work to get to 2 to 5%. The enrichment process is an exponential one, so you're actually doing quite a lot of separation to get up to 2 to 5. It's not like that's nothing. That's actually maybe 20% of the way towards a bomb or something like that.
The more you enrich uranium, the faster you'll get to 90%, which is the argument that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has used for years when talking about the Iranian nuclear threat.
Where's Iran? They're 70% of the way there. There it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
And it's one of the justifications that the Trump administration and Israel gave for recent military strikes on Iran.
The US and Israel launching a wide-scale assault on Tehran. President Trump defiant, citing Iran's nuclear program as the reason for the operation.
After being enriched, uranium is converted back into a solid form, and then it's transported to another lab. To build a nuclear bomb, you need a minimum amount of uranium-235. That's what we call critical mass. And there you go, you have the raw material. But of course, a lot more engineering is needed to turn that into a bomb.
You have to sort of build these apparatus that will take your fuel and take it from a safe position to an explosive position and do it over a very short time scale, less than, 1/10 of a second.
Everything we just explained is for how to make a fission bomb, also called the A or atomic bomb. As a reminder, that's the kind that the US dropped on Hiroshima. This A bomb is the basis for a more powerful bomb that was invented a few years later in 1951. This newer bomb is called the H bomb for hydrogen, and it works with fusion. Unlike fission, which works by splitting heavy elements, fusion is when you take two lighter elements and merge them together. In the case of the H-bomb, fusion involves two isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. The problem is that in nature, these two elements really don't like to fuse. To successfully compress them, extremely high temperatures are required. That's why the H-bomb is made up of two parts. The first one you see here is an A-bomb. When it explodes, it produces an enormous amount of heat, which then triggers a fusion reaction in the second level of the bomb. This makes H-bombs far more powerful than A-bombs. In 1952, the US tested its very first H-bomb. Ivy Mike, which is the name of the bomb, was equivalent to 10.4 million tons of TNT. For comparison, the bomb drop on Hiroshima was equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT.
Weapons in the megaton range, these big weapons, they are much more powerful and much more destructive than the previous atomic bombs. So a weapon like the Hiroshima bomb could destroy a medium-sized city or would destroy the sort of downtown area of a very large city like New York City or something like that. A 15 megaton bomb would destroy the entire New York City metro area.
However, these are very large and heavy, which isn't really convenient. Countries have actually stopped building H-bombs that are that powerful and oversized. Instead, they build smaller weapons. But when we say smaller, we're still talking about bombs that are 20 times stronger than the one dropped on Hiroshima. So if the real secret isn't how to build a bomb, then why don't more countries have it? We're talking about just 9 countries out of 195. Why is that? Well, carrying a bomb to its target is actually much more difficult than making one. To do it, we need what's called nuclear delivery systems. Those are things like submarines or aircraft, but they're also the missiles that are placed inside them. Essentially, it's anything that makes it possible to carry a nuclear warhead from point A to point B. Because when we're talking about nuclear weapons, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about one bomb. We're talking about a full arsenal that's made up of a lot of weapons. And a delivery system is essential for the weapons to actually be a deterrent against potential attacks. Because if you have bombs but no way to launch them, they're pretty useless.
When we focus on nuclear weapons, we often are focusing mostly on the warhead, because that's the interesting nuclear part. The missiles, the submarines, the planes, those tend to be much more expensive and technically more difficult at times, especially for some countries. And if you don't have a way of getting the bomb to a target, you can't really threaten that target.
And that technology isn't within everyone's reach. In fact, it is rocket science.
If you don't have a space program or a lot of experience with rockets, you're going to need help developing rockets.
For its arsenal, the US uses what's called the triad.
So the nuclear triad is land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles in silos, sea-based submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and weapons that can be launched from bombers. So these are gravity bombs, and they might be air-launched cruise missiles.
And no, there's no big red button that you can push to launch this missile.
One way to think about it is that would be almost too easy. You wouldn't want a way to launch nuclear weapons that you could accidentally set off. You wouldn't want a system to launch weapons that a cat would set off.
Finally, one of the reasons why so few countries have nuclear weapons is, well, because they're not allowed to.
So the non-proliferation treaty has been in force since 1970. Although it has its critics, it's been one of the most successful, almost fully subscribed treaties to reduce the risk from nuclear weapons.
The treaty recognizes 5 nuclear weapon states because they already had the bomb before it was signed. That's the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. The rest have committed not to develop nuclear weapons, and they've agreed to have their civilian facilities, like nuclear plants, inspected. And that's significant because the treaty was signed by 191 countries. So how did 4 new countries manage to get the bomb after the treaty was signed? Well, on one side, you have Pakistan, India, and Israel, who never signed the treaty. And then there's North Korea, who signed the NPT at first, but withdrew in 2003. Since withdrawing and launching its nuclear weapons program, North Korea has been subjected to heavy financial sanctions and embargoes on several of its exports. And with each new nuclear test, the sanctions get heavier. Iran also signed the treaty, but it was called into non-compliance because of undeclared activities 20 years ago.
The criticism of the treaty is, well, okay, if it's so great, why didn't it prevent Iran from doing all of these secret things? Well, there's no perfect treaty. But the good news is that without the treaty, we would never have known what Iran was doing. We might have many, many more nuclear states.
Between technological challenges, cost, and international pressure, it's clear that getting the bomb is not so simple after all. And anyway, do all countries even want nuclear weapons?
The countries that have joined the non-proliferation treaty as non-nuclear weapon states have decided that there's more security in diplomacy and the absence of nuclear weapons than there is in getting them themselves. Treaties don't last forever, and, we have to work very actively to, support and strengthen those norms.
And is owning these terrifying bombs even worth the risk?
Why does anybody want nuclear weapons? They're so, they're so risky, so dangerous. They have such destructive potential. It's not an overstatement to say that we could destroy the planet with the nuclear weapons that are out there now.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.